Tonight we're arriving at, I feel like a lot of chapters, I'm going to say this is one of the most important chapters of the Bible. So, get ready for me to say that often, but this is a very important turning point in the entire book of Genesis, because up until this point, the story has been focused on humanity as a whole, right? We saw creation, we saw the flood, the fall, the Tower of Babel. And through all those stories, we see the same pattern that's repeated again and again. Humanity is drifting further away from God. And Genesis 11 just kind of ended with the story of the Tower of Babel, where people tried to build a name for themselves instead of honoring God. And so when we reach this chapter, something is going to change in the story. Instead of focusing on the nations as a whole, God is going to begin working through one man. His name is Abram. And through Abram, God is going to begin forming a covenant family, which through that family is going to come a nation. And through that nation, God will eventually bring the Messiah into the world. So this is going to be a story about someone who leaves their homeland. It's going to be the beginning of a covenant that's going to shape the rest of the Bible. And then one of the things that I do like about this chapter is that Abram, he's not introduced as like this perfect hero of faith. He is just simply someone that God calls. And as we walk through this chapter, we're going to see something that's very real about faith, and that it grows. It is not something that is just you easily have right away perfectly, right? Like Abram is going to obey God in a lot of incredible ways, but he's also going to struggle and make mistakes and learn to trust God step by step. So it's very encouraging, because the journey of faith, it's obviously never perfect. And it's a process of learning to trust God more deeply over time. So we're going to walk through that, and we're going to look at three, maybe I think there's more actually movements in the chapter. So the first one is movement one. I'm actually about to text my husband to bring me some water because I don't know why, but if I talk too much, I start to lose my breath. Okay, so movement one. This is God calling Abram out of everything familiar. So this chapter is where the whole story just kind of shifts, right? Like, you can feel it. We watched humanity just kind of try and make a name for themselves in the last chapter. And now God is like, all right, well, I'm going to make a name, but I'm going to do it my way through one man. Okay, so it starts very blunt. And the first verse says, now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will shew thee. So that is not like a, hey, go follow your dreams type of verse. That is like a full separation verse. Like, hey, leave your country. Thank you. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's house, and go where I tell you, without a map. And just so you know, in Acts 7, this is a spoiler. It just kind of makes it even crazier, because Stephen says God actually appeared to Abram back in Mesopotamia before Haran, meaning God has been calling him and repeating this. And Abram's obedience has just kind of been growing in stages. Okay, it's not perfect, but it's growing. So then God starts stacking promises on top of the command, because in verse 2 it says, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. So notice it says, I will, I will, I will. So God is essentially putting all the weight on himself. And then it kind of goes even further, because now in verse 3 it says, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So this is like kind of massive, because God, he's not just saying like, hey, I'm going to help you. He's saying, hey, I'm going to use you like a pipeline, like a channel where blessing is just going to run through you and hit the whole earth. And yes, ultimately that points forward to Jesus coming through Abram's line, because that's how all families of the earth get blessed for real, not, with just money, but with redemption, which is really cool. So now for movement 2. I call this one obedience that is real, but it's not perfect. So, hold on. So we see Abram, he moves. Okay. Verse 4, it says, so Abram departed, but as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So I always pause here, because Abram, he's 75 years old. Okay. And so it is kind of nice, because like sometimes we act like, well, if I didn't start at 22, then it's kind of over. But he's 75, and God's like, yeah, we're starting now. But also, when the Bible says, Abram was 75 when God called him, that doesn't necessarily mean that he looked like a modern 75-year-old today, right? Because people in that era, they lived a lot longer. So 75 may have been closer to like late middle age in terms of like strength and ability. But also Lot went with him, which is interesting, because God told him to leave his kindred, and Lot is literally his family. And so again, it's obedience, but it's not clean obedience, but it is progress obedience. So it's not perfect. Again, this is nice, because sometimes us as disciples, we want to be obedient, but we know that we're not 100% perfect. And it's very easy for us to feel guilty and to feel shame. But it's nice to know that one of the most important people here in the Bible didn't have perfect obedience. He had progress obedience. So that's the key word there. So now, verse 5, and Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So it's like a whole migration, right? It's not just him and Sarai with like a suitcase. When they arrive, it's not an empty land that's waiting for him, like, welcome, king. It's occupied. And so verse 6, it says, and Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. So, sorry, I just thought it said chat was disconnected. So that line matters, because God's promise doesn't remove obstacles first, right? He usually promises, and then he'll step you into resistance. So this brings us to movement 3. This is the altars, the tents, and a faith that is just learning how to live. And so then God speaks again. This is verse 7. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. So what's happening here is Abram, he builds an altar because he's marking the moment. So this is worship, but it's also like I'm putting a stake in the ground spiritually. God said it, so I'm responding. And then it keeps going. In verse 8, it says, and he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. I keep noticing that it says chat disconnected. Are you guys hearing me okay? Like, am I cutting out at all? I just noticed it's saying chat disconnected. Please wait while we try and reconnect you. I just want to make sure you guys are hearing me okay and that there's no, okay. Just want to make sure. Okay. And high on the east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And that right there is such a picture of a believer, okay? Because tent means that he's living like a pilgrim, like he's not settled. And then altar means that he's keeping worship central. And when it says, and called upon the name of the Lord, that means he's not doing this in silence. So that means he's praying, he's depending. And then in verse 9, it says, and Abram journeyed, going on still towards the south. So he's moving, he's worshiping and praying and moving again. Okay, so that's faith in real life. It's not, this is day after day. It's not this like huge, big, dramatic moment. So now in movement 4, this is the famine test and the Egypt detour. So this is where a test hits him, kind of immediately, because in verse 10, it says, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. So now this is kind of where we have to think a little bit more honestly here, because Abram, he trusted God enough to leave home, but now he's struggling to trust God with food, right? Because there's a famine going on. That's relatable. Like, we can believe God for big calling stuff, but then the second rent is due, the second the body gets sick or anxiety spikes, we start reaching for Egypt. And Egypt is the place that looks like it has resources and stability, but it's also a place that God didn't call him to. And so, the text doesn't show Abram praying there, but it does show him moving. And so for movement 5, I call this one, fear makes him control and control makes him compromise. And so Abram, what happens is he gets close to Egypt, and now fear takes over. And in verse 11, it says, and it came to pass when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. So, one detail that might surprise people in this chapter is that, the age of Sarai when Abram and her travel into Egypt, right? So at this point in the story, Abram's 75, and we're told in verse 4 that she would have been about 65. And so, they arrive in Egypt and they say that the Egyptians, they immediately notice her beauty. So like in verse 11, where it says, behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. So it just kind of and then the following verses will explain that the princes of Pharaoh saw her and spoke highly of her before Pharaoh himself, which led her into being taken into the Pharaoh's house. So now a lot of people that will read this, again, they kind of think that this is surprising because, 65 today is considered elderly, but the world of Genesis, again, very different terms, in terms of like lifespan. So Sarai eventually lives to be about 127 years old. So that means, that at 65, she's only halfway through her life. And so people during this patriarchal period are living, a lot longer than people do today. A lot of Bible teachers also believe that, the aging process here is a lot more slower. So their life at that stage, may have had the strength and appearance of someone who's middle-aged today. So that just kind of explains why Sarai would still be described as very beautiful. And also why Abram fears that, these powerful men in Egypt would desire her enough to take her in. So now in the ancient world, rulers sometimes brought women into the royal households to become wives, or like a concubine, which is basically, in the biblical world, is a woman who lived with a man in a relationship that's similar to a wife, but she doesn't have the same legal status or rights or honor as as a wife. And so he's worried that if the Egyptians knew that Sarai is his wife, they might kill him and take her. And so even though Abram tries to manage the situation through his own plan by asking Sarai to say that that's his sister. Okay, so the story ultimately shows that God is still protecting Sarai and preserving the promise that's going to come through their family line. So now, in verse 12, where it says, therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, they shall say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. So he's basically saying they're going to murder me and keep you. And then it says in verse 13, say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. So this is what fear does. It makes you protect yourself first. And yes, later we also do find out that Sarai is his half sister. So Abram can convince himself that it's not a full lie. And so also, for us today, we do us finding out, that is his half sister, that can sound strange because obviously in our culture and laws, that kind of relationship, it's obviously not allowed and normal. But the world in early Genesis, it's very different. Okay. So the human population, it's still small. Families were a lot closer. The specific marriage laws that forbid close relatives, they don't come until much later in the law of Moses. So it does feel unusual reading this now, but it's not viewed the same way during that period. But the intent here is deception, right? The goal is, well, keep me alive. So that is the first big crack that we see in Abram's faith journey. Okay. And again, it's because he's human. And so he's still learning who God is. So now we get to movement 6. Sarai is taken and God has to step in. He has to step in pretty hard. So then the consequence just kind of, it hits almost immediately. Because in verse 14, it says, and it came to pass that Abram was come into Egypt, and the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair. So just like Abram feared, people start noticing Sarai right away. Word basically spreads about how beautiful she is. And then it just kind of goes a step further, because in verse 15, it says, the princes also of Pharaoh saw her and commended her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. So what's happening here is that Pharaoh's officials, they see Sarai and they report her beauty to Pharaoh, and she gets brought into the royal household. And so in that time, the kings, they took the women to, go into the palace to be a part of their household. So now she's in the Pharaoh's house, and Abram's basically lost control of the situation completely. Like the very thing he was afraid of happening has happened. And so now here's the strange part. In verse 16, it says, "And he entreated Abram well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen, and he asses, and men servants, and maid servants, and she asses, and camels." And so, in other words, Pharaoh is treating Abram really well because he thinks Sarai is just his sister. So now Abram is receiving livestock, servants, and wealth while Sarai is inside the Pharaoh's house, right? So it's just kind of a really uncomfortable situation when you kind of stop and think about it, because his plan to protect her actually put her in danger instead. And so what's even more interesting is that on the surface, Abram does seem to be benefiting from that situation. He's gaining wealth and favor, but just because something just kind of looks like it's working out materially, it doesn't mean that it's actually right. The story is kind of showing us here that he tried to solve the problem his own way, and it immediately created a bigger mess. So now in movement 7, the Pharaoh rebukes him and God drags him back on track. And then, this is the moment where God has to step in. And in verse 17, it says, "And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife." So something starts happening inside the Pharaoh's household. It doesn't tell us what type of plague. It says that God strikes Pharaoh and the people in his house with serious afflictions. So that could have been sudden sickness or disease or some kind of physical suffering that's not normal. Whatever it was severe enough that Pharaoh and the people around him realized very quickly that something was very wrong. And so at some point, they connect the problem back to Sarai. In other words, the Pharaoh realizes that taking this woman into his household has brought trouble in his house. So now the situation becomes very clear to him that Sarai isn't just Abram's sister, that she's actually his wife. And that moment, the Pharaoh understands that, and now everything changes. So what's happening here is God is stepping into to stop the situation before it can go any further, right? Sarai is inside the Pharaoh's house, which means that the promise that God made to Abram is almost now at risk, because remember, the future child that God promised would come through Abram and Sarai, if Sarai becomes a part of the Pharaoh's household, that promise line gets compromised. And so God has to intervene directly. And so the plague just kind of forces the Pharaoh to stop what's happening and return Sarai. So he's protecting her. And he's also protecting the promise that's going to lead the nation of Israel, and much later to the coming of the Messiah. And so then Pharaoh confronts Abram. And honestly, this is one of those moments where it just kind of makes it a little uncomfortable. Hold on, guys. I don't know if this is a real person. I don't know. I don't think this is a real person. I'm just gonna. Okay. Phil, can you handle that, please? Okay. So then, so now Pharaoh confronts Abram. And honestly, this is one of those moments in the story that just, it kind of makes it a little uncomfortable, because the person who's correcting Abram here, it's not a prophet, it's not a priest, it's not someone who knows that the God of the God of Israel. It's Pharaoh, right? He's a pagan king. And so when Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's household in verse 15, the situation becomes very dangerous for the promise of God, for the promise that God just made to Abram. Okay. So remember, earlier in the chapter, God promised that Abram's descendants would just become a great nation, and that the future blessing to the world would come through his line. So that promise is dependent on Abram and Sarai eventually having a child together. So she's taken there, everything's at risk. So now what happens next is very important. In verse 17, it says, "And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai's, Abram's wife." So notice what triggers the plague. It says the plague happens because of Sarai. So now what's interesting here is that this is similar to what happens in the Exodus story. So in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh is holding the Israelites in his land, and God sends plagues into Egypt in order to force the Pharaoh to release them. This is a spoiler. And so in both situations, God is sending plagues on Pharaoh's house because someone who belongs to God's covenant line is being held there. And so in this chapter, it's Sarai. In Exodus, it's the nation of Israel. And so in a small way, Sarai in the Pharaoh's house is kind of like a mini preview of Israel in Egypt. Pharaoh takes someone connected to God's promise. God sends plagues, and Pharaoh realizes that something is wrong, and he sends them away. And so it's just kind of another way that the Bible is showing that God is protecting the promise, even when human decisions create problems. And what's, kind of fascinating is that in both stories, the Pharaoh ends up doing the same thing. He sends them out of Egypt. And so now, verse 18, it says, "And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this that thou hast done unto me? And why didst thou not tell me that she was thy wife?" So Pharaoh is summoning Abram, and he's basically saying, like, what did you do here? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Now, remember, he took her into the house thinking that she's his sister. Now his house is being struck with like serious affliction. Something is clearly wrong. And then he realizes and just kind of traces the problem back to them. And so, he finds out that she's his wife, and now he's pissed. So from his perspective, Abram put him in a very dangerous position, because if Pharaoh had unknowingly taken another man's wife, that would have been a serious offense even in this ancient world. And so it's kind of ironic when you think about it, because Abram is the one who knows about the true God, and Abram is the one who just received the promises from God in this chapter, and yet here he is being corrected by a king who doesn't even worship God at all. And so now Pharaoh just kind of keeps pressing the issue. In verse 19, it says, "Why saidst thou, she is my sister? So I might have taken her to me to wife. Now, therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way." So basically, the Pharaoh is saying, do you realize what could have happened here? I almost took this woman to be my wife because of what you told me. In other words, Abram's deception nearly caused the Pharaoh to do something wrong without even knowing it. And so thankfully, Pharaoh just immediately ends the situation. He gives her back to Abram and tells her and him to leave. There's no negotiation. There's no discussion. Pharaoh just wants them gone and the problem to be removed from his household. which is, I mean, lucky for him, you know? And so, this chapter just kind of closes with the final detail in verse 20, where it says, "And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had." So Pharaoh orders his men to escort Abram out of Egypt. He's almost like he's saying, like, make sure they leave. And so they're sent away, from Egypt. And interestingly, Abram leaves with all the possessions that he gained while he was there. And so when you kind of step back and look at it, you can see what God is doing in the middle of his failure. Because Abram tried to handle the situation through, fear and deception. And it created a mess. But God still stepped in to protect Sarai and preserve the promise. So God ends up using Pharaoh's anger to push Abram out of Egypt and back towards the land that God originally called him to. And so even though Abram panicked, made a bad decision, God didn't abandon the plan. Abram detoured, and God just came in and corrected his direction. He failed, but God was still faithful. He's still faithful to the promise that he had made. And so, it's actually something very interesting that's happening in the story, that a lot of people might miss, is that the situation with Abram and Sarai and the Pharaoh in this chapter just it ends up foreshadowing here that something will happen about 400 years later in the book of Exodus. If you kind of think about the pattern for a second, Abram goes down into Egypt because there's a famine in the land, right? Later in the Bible, the descendants of Abraham will also end up going down into Egypt during a famine in Joseph's time. And then in this chapter, Sarai ends up being inside the Pharaoh's household. The situation becomes dangerous for God's people. And then in the Exodus story, the Israelites end up living under the Pharaoh's power and eventually become oppressed there. And so, that's where you see that something specific is happening in both stories. God sends plagues, right, on Pharaoh and his household. He strikes his house with plagues. And then same thing, he ends up doing the famous plague of Egypt through Moses to force Pharaoh to release the Israelites. And so, the result is the same in both situations. And so I think what we're seeing here is just kind of like a preview of a bigger story that's going to happen later. God is already showing that he protects his people, and that even powerful kings like the Pharaoh can't stop the plan that God set in motion. And so, even through Abram's failure, it just kind of sets up a moment where God demonstrates his protection anyway. And so it's just, an interesting observation. A lot of people kind of point out about that preview that's going to happen. And, and it's, I think that a lot of people kind of also see this as a small preview, of the bigger redemption story that's going to happen later in the Bible. And I think there is also another detail here that is very interesting. If you notice at the end of the chapter in verse 20, it says, "And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had." And so, Pharaoh orders his men, right, to escort them out of Egypt with all the possessions that he gained while he was there. And so Abram entered Egypt as like a foreigner during a famine, but he ends up leaving with wealth and livestock and servants and everything Pharaoh had given him. And so, it's just interesting to notice that hundreds of years later, the descendants of Abraham that are going to be living in Egypt, when God delivers them through Moses, and the Pharaoh finally lets them go, the people of Israel leave Egypt carrying silver and gold and clothing and wealth that the Egyptians gave them. And so both stories still follow that pattern. God's people go down into Egypt, trouble happens, plague happens, but they leave with wealth. And so it's almost like, it's just, again, a small preview of a bigger story that's going to unfold later. And it's just a reminder that when Abram makes mistakes in this chapter, God is still protecting the promise that's still moving forward. And so, it kind of makes you think about what's going on in our lives. Like, where are you tempted to run to Egypt when famine hits? Like, where do you go when life gets tight and you feel exposed? Because this chapter is kind of showing that call is real. The promise is real. The process is also real. And faith is going to grow. Obedience is going to grow. And Abram, he's not a superhero right here. This is a man that's being built. But God doesn't cancel him for failing. He corrects him and still protects him and keeps the story moving forward. And it should give you hope, because sometimes we act like our one mistake might disqualify us from, his favor. And, this chapter is just kind of like, you may have taken a detour, but God is still holding on to that promise. And so I think as we close tonight, this chapter is just, really showing us the beginning of something huge in the Bible. This is God working through one man and one family to bring a blessing to the world. Abram probably has no idea how significant this moment was from his perspective. He's just simply leaving his home and stepping into the unknown. But from God's perspective, this is just the beginning of a plan that eventually leads to the nation of Israel and ultimately to the coming of Jesus. And it just reminds us of how God works and how many times the moments that seem small in our lives are a part of something that's a lot bigger that we can't see. And God usually starts his greatest works with very simple steps of obedience. And so I think the biggest takeaway here from this chapter is that God is able to take ordinary people, ordinary decisions, and moments of faith and just kind of weave them into a story that goes far beyond what we can imagine. And since this is going to be our last study together until Monday, something that I want to kind of encourage you guys to sit with, for the next couple days is take a little time and ask yourself where in your life God might be calling you to trust him more. Abram, he didn't have a map when God called him. He was asked to leave what was familiar and to step into something that he couldn't see. And that kind of trust is just something that every believer, including myself, we have to learn over time. And so spend a little time in prayer over the next couple days and ask God to show you where he's inviting you to trust him in a much deeper way. It might be a decision that you are putting off. Maybe it's something that you've been holding onto out of fear, or maybe it's just, learning to surrender control in an area of your life, because sometimes the biggest steps of faith just starts in tiny ways, very quietly. It's just between you and God. And so sit with that, pray about it, and we'll continue the story together when we come back on Monday, and we'll see what God does next in his journey. Again, I want to thank you guys for being here and studying this. I'm always going to let you know how grateful I am, to every one of you that take the time to open your Bible and learn alongside this community. If this study, helped you understand Genesis more clearly, consider sharing it with someone who might want to grow in their understanding of scripture. Again, next time we continue the story, we're going to see how God begins to develop his covenant with Abram. even further as his journey of faith just kind of unfolds. Thank you guys. Have a great night. Have a great weekend. I'm grateful for you all. I'll see you guys Monday. Bye, guys.